C. Frederic John, otherwise known as Fred John, that's how I knew him, enjoys a global reputation as a strategic researcher with a career spanning over 40, that's right, 40 years. He specializes in melding profound insights into concrete recommendations for clients and in crafting compelling research deliverables using storytelling techniques, which of course is why he's here. He's got a book all about that being released this Thursday, November 11th. Welcome to the program, Fred John.
Thank you, Mike.
Fred, I always like to say this story is about really this podcast is really about uncorking the stories behind the stories from writers. And I'm curious, Fred, where does your story as a writer begin?
Well, I would say in a very, very primitive stage. It goes back to my childhood. I grew up in an academic household, and lots of books were always around. And my father would read us adventure stories like Robinson Crusoe and Kidnapped and Jungle Book. So I got into stories that way. And then I had a kind of very formative experience with a writer called Walter R. Brooks, who wrote a series of children's books around a character called Freddie the Pig. And of course, being a Freddie, I was very much attracted to this. And Freddie was a pig on a barnyard in upstate New York, and he had a lot of adventures. Every book he took on a different role. Freddie became a detective, a cowboy. He published a barnyard newspaper.
It's a very versatile pig you're talking about here, Fred.
This was a very productive pig, and so my role model, in a sense, was not human. Brooks, by the way, before he started this series, wrote a series of stories about a talking horse, Mr. Ed.
Of course.
Who became a TV celebrity after Mr. Brooks himself had passed away. Anyway, so in emulating my role model, I started writing a family newspaper, and which, became then, in later years, school newspapers, and also wrote some pretty childish poetry. So that was kind of, my early writing years. And after that, nothing much. Wrote some nonsense poetry in college. But only later in life, I took on, as a market researcher, I obviously had to write reports. So I, got into those, and I started writing articles about the market research industry, which became sort of provocative, which I enjoyed doing. I also, in later life, started writing some song parodies along political lines, including a version of the musical Oklahoma, which was based on this George Bush's, the second Bush's administration, and also some other political writings that I have on my own occasional blog, C. Fred Reflections, which include also some political song parodies, mainly focused on Trump. So in effect, a lot of my writing experience comes from the early years, but most of when I really started thinking of myself as a writer from the last dozen years or so.
Got it. So when you were younger, sort of thinking about what you wanted to do with your life, did it ever cross your mind that you'd like to do something in publishing, whether it was journalism or other forms of writing, or did you decide to take a different path in your career?
I don't think I ever considered seriously writing. I think it was always more of a hobby. And then, I ended up is the wrong word. I focused on politics and history in college and graduate school. Then I got a degree in historical musicology, which was a lot of fun, but didn't lead to any jobs. And I sort of stumbled into the market research profession by accident and never found the exit.
How did you, it's interesting. I mean, just having worked in the research industry for, myself, a quarter of a century now, I find that most people stumble their way into it. Like nobody leaves, their undergraduate or graduate studies and says, I'm going to be a market researcher. How did you stumble into the market research profession?
Quite honestly, it was a personal connection. A neighbor of my parents, who ran a PR firm, was starting up a small research operation within the PR firm. And they were looking for young people to join it. And, the information was passed on to me. And that wasn't even market research, but more public policy kind of research on issues that were important to their PR clients. And that's how I started. And then, later on, I moved on to more respectable market research firms like Harris and Yankelovich. But I ended up on the client side at MasterCard.
Yeah, I remember those names, Harris and Yankelovich. What do you suppose it is about market research, though, that you say you never found your exit? What did you like or embrace about working in market research?
Well, I think it satisfies a certain uh, curiosity, if people have that. For one thing, you're always, particularly if you're on the supplier side, you're always being exposed to new businesses, new products, new industries. So you have to learn a lot. And so it's that constant challenge. Even at MasterCard, where everything was at the time pretty much plastic in one form or another, you had to learn about how money and lending and banking works in multiple countries. So there's that learning aspect. But also there's a curiosity of your job is to answer questions. So it's a way of understanding really what the underlying roots of the issues are that may be challenging your clients, and what is the best way of answering their questions, coming up with the guidance they need, and then very much grappling with all this data. And as you know, most research produces far more data than is relevant. So how do you work through that? And so it's, again, it's a problem solving. It's like, in a way, being like a detective, and you're looking for the link or the insight that explains and resolves everything.
Yeah, and so much of it is knowing what are the right questions to ask. So in a world of infinite questions, kind of bringing it down to the most important questions, but then also kind of how to take your curiosity and hunt for clues. I mean, just to take your detective, comparison a little bit, how to look for clues and put those together so that they give you sort of a satisfying answer, right, to whatever question it is you're looking for. That's how I always thought of it. I always thought of myself as a bit of a detective, kind of on a hunt for sort of interesting and important, relevant knowledge and insights. What role does storytelling play in market research? Because many of us who've worked in the business world for a long time are exposed to all different types of market research. Some of it insightful, some of it just very factual. But tell me about the importance of storytelling in market research, because that's something I'm hearing more and more about.
Well, one of the things is, in the last, maybe a few years, more than that, clients have been demanding more story. So what's the story? Tell me more of something like a story than these very boring reports. And part of the challenge is they're not, the use of the word story and storytelling is not consistent. And part of what was the original impetus for me was to bring a little clarity to these multiple uses of the term. Originally thought of it as maybe an article or a presentation, and kind of grew into a book. But basically, most market research reports and presentations that I've experienced, including many that I've written, are boring as hell. They are not compelling. They have none of the imagination or stickiness of stories. And that's because the market researcher is essentially relating data. And most reports and presentations are overladen with too much factual information. In the quantitative world, basically it's numbers. In the qualitative, it may be the results of focus groups, but very little about the experience of reading or sitting through a presentation gives you that dramatic impact that you get from a good story. It doesn't pull you in, it doesn't hold your attention. And part of what led me into this was a series of training exercises that I did, professional training at MasterCard, which started with how do we become more insightful? And then how do we make our deliverables more impactful and more compelling? And I realized that storytelling, and in fact, the arts, had a lot to teach us. And so I started, thinking more objectively about what can we learn from stories, from literature, from art, from paintings, sculpture, even music. And a lot of that dealt with structure, but also very, there's certain characteristics that you find in each individual art that I found you could pull something from that. For example, the importance of how a story begins is absolutely critical. How do you get, how does a writer get you to turn the page? How does an article get you to read the next paragraph? How does a piece of music get you to continue listening? And from that, I realized the way most market research reports and presentations are structured, they absolutely push people away. There's too much of the due diligence up front. You start with a methodology, which is boring to everyone except researchers. And then you go through the background and objectives, and you tell the client what they already know because they know the background and they wrote the objectives. And then you come to, eventually you get to the meat of the presentation, and that very often is structured basically along the lines of what did we ask, this is what the answers are, rather than what have we learned that's really important to you, the client, that you're paying all this money for. And that may only be a very small part of what you've learned and what you've figured out. So I figured if you take the lessons of story and storytelling, apply them to your reports, apply them to your presentations, you're going to really keep your clients engaged, which then leads to the next thing. They'll actually listen when you start telling them, well, this is what I conclude, this is what I recommend. And so that's kind of where I see storytelling fitting in.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say, if any journalism student wants to see a good example of what burying the lead looks like, they can read pretty much any market research report. Maybe not yours, Fred, but many market research reports. I mean, the leads, it's all buried. It's all buried in noise and background, and most research reports are all about just regurgitating things heard or observed in the research versus what they mean and what the real implications are of it. So I definitely hear what you're saying. So you said that this book kind of came out maybe after sort of taking a seminar or leading some seminars on storytelling at MasterCard. And was it did I hear you correctly? Was it originally you were thinking about writing an article, and this article kind of then turned into a book? Just tell me a little bit more about how the book came about.
Well, over the last 2 years, of course, we had a COVID experience. And as I started pulling together some thoughts for what might have been an article, starting with, here are the 4 meanings of story in business. And one of them is exactly what you're talking about. It's the story being the essential learning, not, all the little bits of things you've learned, but what is it you've learned that you could express in a couple of sentences? This is what it means. This is the ultimate eureka aha moment. So I started pulling that together, and then I realized that from the workshops I'd conducted at MasterCard and afterwards, I had a lot of good material. had a lot of good thinking. And so the challenge for me was, so how do you pull this together coherently into a larger, what became a book, which grew like, I guess, like a lot of books do. And so for me, this challenge very much was structural. I had a lot of things I wanted to say. How could I organize it that each chapter made sense, but it would lead to another chapter and so forth. And I actually thought of, before I get into the market research relevance, I had to come to grips with, what does story mean? What does storytelling mean? And what is the role of the storyteller? And so a lot of what I put in the book is very personal. It didn't draw on anyone else's research or so forth. And I go back to the role of the storyteller as he appears in the Odyssey. And then I draw on a much more recent essay that sort of explains storytelling in the modern sense, but it draws on a lot of Aboriginal US Native American cultures. And that kind of shaped my vision of what storytelling should be. And then what are the essential elements of story that are relevant, that could be put into the research realm? And there I'm looking at things like how stories pull you out of the real world and put you into another place. As simple as, say, a fairy tale starts with once upon a time, which is a good way of letting you know that you're not talking about a specific place, a specific time, and in what follows, you may have all kinds of things that aren't real. The front matter of a book, you go through page after page, you may not read it, but it's a way of preparing you for the text that eventually follows. Opera often begins with an overture. So there are lots of different ways in which these people are invited into, through boundaries, into the story itself. And that's where I come back to the market research reporter presentation. Put something up front that really grabs people, other than turns them away with a long description of your methodology. Make your background and objectives more compelling. Don't make them just very plain. And certainly in the presentation, where I put a lot of emphasis, become a presenter that is more like a performer, even a magician, not a very neutral pseudo-academic type with a really boring tone.
Interesting. Thinking about different organizations and organizational cultures. Just thinking about all the different clients I've had the good fortune of working with, from pharmaceutical companies to financial services firms, consumer goods, et cetera. Do you see the tolerance for storytelling being equal across organizations, or are some more open to it than others? Because there is, in my experience anyway, and I'm somebody who's always been on sort of more the bleeding edge when it comes to methodologies. I mean, I sort of cut my teeth in the .com era, and was doing some really innovative work before most companies were. Also, thinking about ways, I'm a fiction writer as well. So I always try and bring like a more of a flair to both my presentation style, but also like what I choose to put in reports. And I do get feedback sometimes saying, hey, just stick to the facts, versus don't get too creative. So I'm just curious as to, do you see this desire for storytelling equal across organizations, or are some more open to it than others?
I would say you're absolutely right. And you've got to know your client. And in many cases, if you're dealing with a counterpart, if you're, for example, a research supplier conducting a study for a major corporation, you're dealing with an inside corporate researcher, you have to know what the expectations are of that person's management, who are probably paying for the research. And in some cases, they will say, just give us the facts and we'll interpret it. Just tell us what we want to know. Don't be creative. In other cases, they really want to have more of more of a show, something more engaging. Of course, they don't always know. One thing that I offer as a kind of a final way of presenting research is actually turning it into a fictional story. And this is something I've taught in some workshops, and a few of my students have come back who actually were presenting to the pharmaceutical industry, which is a pretty strict sector. And they said, you know, our traditional reports and presentations really didn't fly. So we converted them into a kind of a medieval hero, heroine type of story, and it really worked. And so, you know, I give some lessons and some examples of how you can do that. Now, of course, you're not going to try that on a client that may walk out because they think, you know, all I want is the numbers, all I want is the facts. So again, you have to know your audience ahead of time. But I think there are a lot of the aspects of storytelling that you can incorporate. And I even talk about the use of language and so forth that can get your clients to relate to you, the research teller, as more of a human being than as a very neutral persona.
Yeah. And I think it's also a way for market researchers to really set themselves apart from competition. So, I mean, I speak from more of a qualitative perspective where, you know, my world's a little bit different than to say somebody who works for a big quant firm. I mean, I compete with individuals basically. But you know, what I have heard over the years is that my storytelling abilities are why people hire me. So I'm actually curious to really dig more into your book and learn how I can become an even better storyteller. Which leads me to what are some key things that people will pick up after reading your book? What are some key lessons there? Of course, don't give away the store because people need to buy the book. But what are, you know, let's say there's some market researchers listening to this right now, or even, you know, people in other aspects of marketing who want to learn more about storytelling. But what are some key lessons they're going to walk away with after reading this book, Fred?
I think one of the key things is that you really have to establish what the essential learning is, which is one of the meanings of the word story, before you can do anything else. And you can't do that by simply getting all the data in front of you and going through it very quickly and start writing. You shouldn't start writing until you really do some deep thinking. And a lot of what that involves, coming up with the essential learning, is a series of steps, which I lay out, which is like taking, you know, you have a table full of jigsaw pieces, puzzle pieces, and you want to start pulling them together in some meaningful way. Well, we all know how we do that. You know, you look for edge pieces, or you look for pieces with, you know, similar things on them, and do they fit, don't they fit? And you sort of build up a structure, maybe multiple structures, and eventually you try to pull it all together. And as you pull things together, the picture becomes clearer and clearer. And ultimately, if you're really thinking about it, you come up with, what does this all mean? And part of that is also asking yourself constantly, as you look at every single finding or group of findings, well, this is interesting. What does it mean? What are the implications of this? And also, what could cause this? What's the causality behind it? Is there a cause and effect relationship between some of the variables? And all of this is mental activity. So we talk about AI and machine learning and all kinds of other things that help collect data, which is great, and maybe even synthesize a little bit. But this ultimate synthesis is a human activity. And part of what I'm saying is, don't shortchange that. Now, what I hear from a lot of my research colleagues is, that's great, but we're not given the time to think. And, you know, we come out of the field, or you finish your focus groups, and the next day they want a top line, which to me is the worst thing a client could ever want, because it's like, I can give you the wrong answer really quickly. I haven't thought about it, but here it is. So you really have to push back on client demand and say, well, give me a little more time to think about this, and I will make the value you get will be much greater. So that's sort of one of the lessons. The other is to think very much about the structure of your deliverables. That not to organize, if let's assume your report or presentation is organized by chapter or topic, really think about not only what goes into each of those, but how you define a chapter. And it may not be by attitudes, behaviors, demographics or whatever, but maybe some combination of those variables leading you to identify different themes. And then how do you connect one theme to the next? So I struggle, just as I did in writing the book, but even whenever I write anything, structure is a very, very important thing. And there are multiple ways of doing it, and you kind of have to experiment with that.
Yep.
Finally, for the research presenter, try to get your audience to focus on you from the moment they enter the room. And I give a lot of suggestions on doing that. One is just turning off the lights and putting the due diligence aspects, namely the methodology, the background objectives on the screen, and just run it as constant slides so people are forced to look at it. And then you get up and you start speaking. So again, a lot of different things one can do to try to engage with your audience.
Talk to me a little bit about the publishing process here, because I'm curious about, I'm always curious about how things come from, go from ideas to actually physical product or digital product, as the case may be. But, you worked with a publisher, it looks like Routledge Press. How did you find your publisher? Did you work through a literary agent? And what was sort of the back and forth and collaborative process with the publisher like?
I would say ultimately, first of all, I was very lucky to end up with Routledge. I had no experience in finding publishers or anything like that. So I asked around, a number of people suggested different publishers to try. And I sent out a few letters to publishers that seemed to be into the business book or professional book, or the marketing research arena. And Routledge was one of the books, one of the publishers someone recommended. And they're actually part of a much larger group called Taylor Francis. And I was lucky enough to connect with, I guess, what we would call an acquisition editor, who, I sent a synopsis of what the topic was, and she asked for some more information, gave me some very good feedback. And then, when I came back with a more revised plan, was able to persuade whomever she had to persuade on the inside that let's take a risk on this book. And it's not a textbook. There are market research textbooks that talk a lot about the how-to. Most of the how-to is in the quant world, it would be various statistical tools. In the qual world, you're talking about semiotics or how to lead a focus group. And most of those books say very little about how do you deliver your results, and what they have given traditionally is really old-fashioned and really boring. Here's a way to structure a report that's guaranteed to put your reader to sleep. So I thought I'm covering basically the deliverable aspect, but that could be an added text or a recommended reading in a market research or a marketing course. But really for anyone, even for the end users, if you're in marketing and you're ordering research, organizing research projects, good to understand what goes into it and how you can lead your suppliers to provide something that's really more interesting to you. So if you're a client saying, I want more story, you can say, well, this is really what I'm looking for.
Excellent. Well, this book will be available this coming Thursday, November 11th. Fred, where can people buy the book?
Well, they can get it on the Routledge website. You can actually find a link on my own website, which is consilienceresearch.com. It's also available on Amazon. And I assume that there are other booksellers who are, you might even be able to get it in the store. Like the Trinity, it appears in 3 forms, and that is hardcover, softcover, and ebook. And I would say whatever works for you, you can get it from whichever medium you choose.
There you go. You could choose your own adventure in that regard. Well, Fred, thank you very much for joining the program. All the best with your book.
Thank you, Mike, for having me.